Commander Zex'thara had witnessed the collapse of 1,000 civilizations, but she had never seen anything quite as pathetic as the human broadcasts streaming across the galaxy. Standing aboard her flagship Dominion's Edge, she watched the intercepted transmissions with growing amusement. The bridge crew of her Kytherian battle fleet gathered around the main display, their crystalline skin shifting between shades of deep purple and silver as they processed what they were seeing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The humans were sharing their dreams. Not battle plans or defensive strategies, but actual dreams. A young human female spoke earnestly into a recording device about wanting to become something called a marine biologist to study creatures in Earth's oceans. Another showed crude drawings of towers that would reach the stars and provide homes for millions. An elderly human male with weathered hands demonstrated a device he claimed would end hunger forever by growing food in places where nothing had ever grown before. Zex'thara's forearms gestured dismissively, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with colors that conveyed deep contempt to her crew. The Kytherians had evolved beyond such frivolous concepts millennia ago. Dreams were inefficiency. Dreams were weakness. Dreams were what lesser species clung to instead of accepting their place in the cosmic order. The commander's voice resonated through the bridge with harmonics that spoke of absolute authority. She had earned her position through centuries of calculated conquest, methodical elimination of obstacles, and unwavering focus on expanding Kytherian dominance across 17 star systems. Her people didn't dream because they didn't need to. They calculated, they executed, they conquered. Her second-in-command, Velnara, manipulated the control interface with her lower arms, while her upper limbs gestured in patterns that indicated confusion. The younger Kytherian had been studying the human transmissions for weeks, trying to understand their tactical significance. She found none. The display showed more human broadcasts, children drawing pictures of cities under the sea, scientists discussing expeditions to distant galaxies, artists creating sculptures that served no military or resource-gathering purpose, engineers designing vehicles that would never be built because they lacked the technology, writers crafting stories about impossible futures where different species worked together instead of the strong dominating the weak. Zex'thara's crew began producing the harmonic frequencies that served as Kytherian laughter. The sound filled the bridge like the ringing of crystal bells, beautiful and cold. These humans were spending their limited lifespans imagining things that would never exist instead of preparing for the reality of their inevitable subjugation. The tactical assessment was clear. Humanity had spread across 37 worlds in their local cluster, but their expansion was chaotic and purposeless. They built cities where Kytherians would have constructed mining operations. They established research stations to study phenomena that had no military applications. They even terraformed worlds not for strategic advantage, but because they wanted to give future generations more places to call home. It was almost insulting how easy this conquest would be. Velnara manipulated the display to show Earth's primary defense installations. The humans had weapons, certainly, but their deployment revealed the same fundamental weakness that infected everything they did. Their orbital platforms were positioned to protect population centers rather than strategic resources. Their fleets prioritized evacuation capabilities over firepower. Most telling of all, their communication networks were filled with messages about hopes for peaceful contact with alien species. The commander studied the tactical data while her markings shifted to colors indicating strategic planning. Earth's moon housed their largest military installation, but even that showed signs of the same delusional thinking. The base included research facilities, civilian quarters, and what appeared to be recreational areas. The humans couldn't even build a proper fortress without cluttering it with irrelevant additions. But what truly sealed humanity's fate was their response to the Kytherian probe ships that had been conducting reconnaissance for the past year. Instead of immediate military mobilization, the humans had sent diplomatic messages. They offered to share their scientific discoveries. They invited the Kytherians to establish cultural exchange programs. They even transmitted samples of their art and music as gifts to welcome new friends to the galaxy. The bridge crew's harmonic laughter intensified. These creatures actually believed that strangers from the void would want to be friends rather than conquerors. Zex'thara accessed her personal files and reviewed the profiles of the other species the Kytherian Empire had absorbed. The Veltari had at least fought with cunning and determination before their defeat. The Mordex had demonstrated impressive technological adaptation under pressure. The Zephyrians had shown the kind of ruthless pragmatism that Kytherians could respect, even as they crushed it. But humans seemed incapable of abandoning their fantasies even when faced with obvious threats. The probe ships had been clearly armed and had performed obvious surveillance activities. Any rational species would have responded with increased military readiness and strategic positioning. Instead, the humans had sent more messages expressing hope for friendship and sharing additional examples of their, quote, cultural achievements. The commander called up the most recent transmission, recorded just days ago from Earth's capital city. A human leader stood before a massive gathering speaking about humanity's greatest dreams for the future. The creature described plans for cities that would float among the clouds of gas giants, expeditions to explore galaxies beyond their own, and projects to seed life on dead worlds throughout the universe. Not a single word about military preparation or defensive strategy. Valnara gestured toward the display with patterns indicating genuine puzzlement. She had been analyzing human history and found the same disturbing pattern repeated across their entire existence. When faced with challenges, instead of immediately seeking the most efficient solution, humans would first imagine impossible answers. They would spend precious time and resources pursuing ideas that had no basis in proven science or established fact. Their technological development showed the same weakness. Instead of focusing purely on advancement that provided immediate tactical advantages, they pursued research into abstract concepts like consciousness, beauty, and meaning. They built machines not just to serve practical functions but to inspire and elevate the human spirit. They even sent exploration vessels to distant star systems not for conquest or resource extraction but simply to satisfy curiosity about what might be out there. The tactical computers had calculated the optimal strategy for conquest with devastating efficiency. A simultaneous strike on 12 key worlds would collapse human civilization within 48 hours. Their scattered fleets could not mount coordinated resistance across such distances. Their leadership structures were too distributed, and their communication networks too vulnerable. Most importantly, their psychology was completely unsuited for the kind of absolute warfare that Kytherians had perfected. Zex'thara began issuing orders to her fleet commanders. 250 Kytherian vessels would emerge from hyperspace at precisely calculated points throughout human territory. Each ship was a masterpiece of destructive efficiency, designed and built for the sole purpose of overwhelming enemy forces through superior firepower and tactical coordination. The humans wouldn't know what was happening until it was already over. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of Luna Research Station, watching Earth rotate slowly beneath her feet, and allowed herself to dream impossible dreams. In 3 hours, she would present her proposal to the Global Science Council, a project so ambitious that her colleagues had initially assumed she was joking. But Sarah had spent the last 5 years developing plans that would fundamentally change humanity's relationship with the cosmos itself. The project was called Genesis Garden, and it represented everything that made humans different from every other species they had imagined encountering among the stars. While a practical civilization might focus on faster weapons or stronger shields, Sarah had dedicated her life to creating something that served no military purpose whatsoever. She wanted to build machines that could transform dead worlds into gardens. Not gardens in the agricultural sense, though food production was certainly part of the vision. Sarah dreamed of true gardens, places where life could flourish in all its chaotic, inefficient, beautiful complexity. Her designs included systems for atmospheric transformation, soil creation, weather pattern establishment, and ecosystem seeding. The technology existed, scattered across dozens of research institutions. What didn't exist was the political will to commit resources to a project that might take centuries to complete and offered no immediate tactical advantages. But Sarah had learned something important about human nature during her 5 years of preparation. Humans could be convinced to attempt nearly anything if you could make them see the dream clearly enough. The observation deck began filling with other researchers and officials arriving for the presentation. Dr. Marcus Webb from the Terraforming Division, already a supporter of the project, brought detailed geological surveys of 12 candidate worlds. Captain Lisa Rodriguez from Fleet Command represented the military's interest in any project requiring significant resource allocation, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Administrator Chen Wei spoke for the Colonial Planning Bureau that would need to coordinate with any large-scale terraforming effort. But the person Sarah watched most carefully was Director Elena Vasquez, whose approval would be necessary for any project of this magnitude. Vasquez had built her career on practical achievements, infrastructure projects that solved immediate problems for existing human settlements. Convincing her to support something as visionary as Genesis Garden would require Sarah to appeal to something deeper than mere practicality. As the presentation began, Sarah noticed something odd about the data feeds from the outer system monitoring stations. There were irregular signals in the background noise, patterns that didn't match known natural phenomena or human technology. She made a mental note to investigate later, but for now, her entire focus needed to be on the dream she was about to share. The main display activated, showing a detailed three-dimensional model of a dead world designated as Target Alpha in the Kepler 442 system. The planet had the right mass and orbital characteristics to support life, but lacked atmosphere, liquid water, and any organic compounds. To most observers, it appeared to be exactly what it was: a barren rock circling a distant star. But Sarah saw something entirely different when she looked at that data. She saw forests that didn't exist yet, covering continents that were currently nothing but exposed stone and metal. She saw rivers that could flow through valleys, carved by machines that hadn't been built yet. She saw cities where humans and whatever alien species they might encounter could work together on projects that served no purpose except the joy of creation itself. The presentation began with technical specifications, because Director Vasquez would need to understand the practical challenges before she could appreciate the vision. Atmospheric processors would need to operate for decades to create breathable air. Soil generators would transform rock and mineral deposits into rich earth capable of supporting plant life. Weather control systems would establish stable climate patterns. Genetic banks would provide the seeds, literally and figuratively, for entire ecosystems. Dr. Webb contributed geological analysis, showing how the planet's mineral composition could be transformed into fertile ground. Captain Rodriguez explained the logistical challenges of transporting the necessary equipment across interstellar distances. Administrator Chen Wei outlined the coordination requirements for a project spanning multiple generations. But as Sarah watched Director Vasquez's expression, she realized that technical specifications weren't going to be enough. The director understood the engineering challenges and resource requirements. What she didn't understand was why anyone would want to attempt something so ambitious when humanity faced more immediate concerns. Sarah switched to a different kind of presentation. Instead of charts and calculations, she began showing images of what Genesis Garden could create. The display filled with concept art created by humanity's most gifted visual artists, showing worlds transformed from dead rock into living paradises. Cities that grew like living things, their architecture incorporating biological elements that served both aesthetic and functional purposes. Landscapes where technology and nature had merged into something entirely new, neither artificial nor natural but somehow transcending both categories. The images showed children who hadn't been born yet playing in forests that didn't exist yet on worlds that were currently lifeless rock. They showed scientists making discoveries in research stations built among trees whose genetic code had been crafted by human engineers, but whose growth patterns followed the chaotic beauty of natural evolution. They showed art galleries and concert halls and theaters built in perfect harmony with alien ecosystems that humanity would help to create. But most importantly, the images showed something that no practical military or economic project could provide. They showed wonder. Director Vasquez leaned forward in her chair, and Sarah noticed that the skeptical expression had been replaced by something else. Not yet conviction, but curiosity. The kind of curiosity that had driven humans to explore dangerous oceans, and climb impossible mountains, and reach for distant stars long before they had any practical reason to do so. Sarah began describing the timeline. The first phase would involve sending automated systems to begin atmospheric transformation and basic geological preparation. Robots would work for decades in environments that would kill any living thing, slowly creating the conditions necessary for life to take hold. The second phase would introduce simple organisms, bacteria and algae, and primitive plants that could survive in the hostile environment while continuing the transformation process. But it was the third phase that made Director Vasquez's eyes light up with something that looked almost like hunger. Humans would begin arriving not as colonists or miners or soldiers, but as gardeners. They would guide the evolution of ecosystems, help species adapt to their new environments, and create forms of life that had never existed anywhere in the universe. The project would require unprecedented cooperation between dozens of specialized fields. Geneticists would need to work with atmospheric engineers to ensure that new life forms could survive in alien environments. Artists would collaborate with ecologists to design landscapes that were both beautiful and sustainable. Philosophers and ethicists would help determine how to responsibly create new forms of consciousness. And at the center of it all would be the dream that had driven Sarah to spend 5 years of her life on what most people considered an impossible fantasy. The dream of proving that intelligence could be used for creation instead of destruction, that technology could serve beauty instead of just efficiency, that humanity could choose to nurture life throughout the galaxy instead of simply consuming resources. Dr. Webb pulled up geological surveys of 11 other candidate worlds, each offering different challenges and opportunities. A water world where floating cities could be established among artificial islands. A high-gravity planet where new forms of architecture would need to be developed. A world with extreme seasonal variations that would require ecosystems capable of adaptation on a scale never before attempted. Captain Rodriguez presented logistical analyses showing how the project could be accomplished with existing technology, though it would require resource commitments on a scale comparable to humanity's entire space program. The numbers were staggering, but they were also achievable if humanity chose to prioritize long-term vision over short-term gains. Administrator Chen Wei outlined the regulatory and coordination frameworks that would be necessary to manage a project spanning multiple star systems and potentially several centuries. The bureaucratic challenges were as complex as the technical ones, requiring new forms of international cooperation and governance structures that didn't currently exist. But as the presentation continued, Sarah noticed that the participants were no longer thinking about obstacles and challenges. They were beginning to imagine solutions. Dr. Webb started sketching modifications to atmospheric processors that could work more efficiently in different planetary environments. Captain Rodriguez began calculating optimal transport routes and supply chain management strategies. Administrator Chen Wei started designing governance models that could adapt to changing circumstances over decades or centuries. Director Vasquez asked the question that Sarah had been hoping to hear. What would you need to begin the first phase? The answer was both simple and revolutionary. They would need humanity to decide that dreams were worth pursuing, even when they served no immediate practical purpose. They would need political leaders willing to commit resources to projects that might not show results for generations. They would need scientists willing to dedicate their careers to research that might never directly benefit them personally. Most importantly, they would need to convince an entire species that the universe was not just a place to be conquered or exploited, but a canvas for the greatest collaborative artwork ever attempted. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her colleagues and realized that something had shifted during the presentation. The skepticism and practical concern had been replaced by the same expression she had seen in mirrors while working on Genesis garden designs late into the night. They were all beginning to see the dream, but as she prepared to discuss specific next steps and resource allocation, the monitoring station data that had been running in the background suddenly changed. The irregular signals that had been barely noticeable noise throughout the presentation were suddenly much stronger and more organized. They showed clear patterns of artificial origin, moving through the outer system with purposeful trajectories. Captain Rodriguez was the first to notice the change. Her training had taught her to continuously monitor threat assessment displays, even during scientific presentations. The expression of wonder and possibility that had been growing on her face was instantly replaced by military alertness. The signals weren't random. They were formation patterns. Ships moving in coordinated groups, using technology that didn't match any known human designs. The Outer System Monitoring Network was detecting at least 200 artificial objects emerging from hyperspace at carefully calculated positions throughout human territory. Sarah watched Director Vasquez's expression change as she processed the implications. Humanity had been dreaming of peaceful contact with alien civilizations for centuries. They had prepared diplomatic protocols and cultural exchange programs. They had sent messages of friendship into space and hoped for responses that would herald a new age of cooperation and understanding. But the formation patterns and emergence coordinates suggested something entirely different. This wasn't a diplomatic mission or a scientific expedition. This was a military operation, designed to overwhelm human defenses through simultaneous attacks across multiple worlds. Captain Rodriguez was already accessing emergency communication channels, sending alerts to Fleet Command and Colonial Defense Forces. But Sarah could see in her expression that the mathematics were hopeless. 200 unknown vessels appearing simultaneously across human space meant that this was a planned invasion by an enemy that had been studying humanity long enough to identify all their strategic weaknesses. Dr. Webb continued working on Genesis Garden calculations, seemingly unaware that the project might become irrelevant within hours. The irony was not lost on Sarah. Humanity had spent decades preparing for peaceful contact, while developing increasingly ambitious dreams for transforming the galaxy into a garden of life and beauty. Now they were about to discover whether those dreams had made them too weak to survive. But as Sarah watched her colleagues responding to the crisis, she noticed something that the enemy ships probably hadn't accounted for. The same visionary thinking that had led humans to dream of impossible gardens had also created technologies and capabilities that might not be immediately obvious to outside observers. The atmospheric processors that Sarah had designed for Genesis Garden could theoretically be modified for other purposes. The genetic engineering techniques developed for ecosystem creation could potentially be applied to more immediate challenges. The coordination frameworks designed for multi-generational projects could be adapted for rapid emergency response. Most importantly, humans who were accustomed to imagining impossible solutions might be better equipped to improvise under pressure than enemies who relied on calculated efficiency. Director Vasquez made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of canceling the Genesis Garden presentation to focus on the military crisis, she authorized immediate implementation of the first phase. Not because terraforming technology would be useful for defense, but because continuing to pursue long-term dreams in the face of immediate threats was itself a form of resistance. The enemy had studied human communications and concluded that dreamers would be easy to defeat. They were about to discover whether humanity's greatest weakness might also be their greatest strength. Sarah looked out at Earth, rotating beneath the space station, and realized that everything was about to change. The dreams that had seemed so important an hour ago might never be realized. The gardens she had imagined might never be planted. The beauty she had hoped to create throughout the galaxy might never exist. But the dream itself had already changed everything. In the next few hours, humanity would discover what nightmares could be created by a species that refused to abandon hope even when faced with the impossible. The attack began at precisely 0347 Universal Standard Time, with surgical precision that would have impressed military tacticians across the galaxy. Zex'thara watched from her command position as Kytherian vessels materialized throughout human space, their crystalline hulls gleaming with internal energy patterns that spoke of absolute confidence. The first phase proceeded exactly as calculated. Human orbital defenses, caught completely unprepared, crumbled under coordinated assault from weapons that operated on principles their science had never encountered. But something was wrong. The humans weren't responding the way conquered species were supposed to respond. Instead of immediate surrender or desperate military counterattacks, they were doing something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. They were implementing emergency protocols that seemed designed for entirely different scenarios than military invasion. Velnara's harmonic frequencies carried notes of confusion as she reported the latest intelligence from the advancing fleets. Human colonies throughout the Centauri sector had activated something called Protocol 7, which appeared to involve rapid industrial conversion on a massive scale. Manufacturing facilities that had been producing consumer goods were suddenly retooling to create unidentified equipment. Agricultural planets were implementing emergency cultivation procedures that required resources far exceeding normal food production needs. Most puzzling of all, the humans were evacuating their populations not to secure military installations, but to what appeared to be completely random locations throughout their territory. Ships filled with civilians were fleeing to asteroid mining stations, deep space research platforms, and even experimental habitats in areas of space that offered no strategic advantages whatsoever. Zex'thara studied the tactical displays with growing irritation, The human response pattern made no sense according to any military doctrine she had studied. They were dispersing their population instead of concentrating it for defense. They were converting industrial capacity away from weapons production toward mysterious civilian projects. They were sending their best scientific minds to remote locations instead of putting them to work on defensive technologies. The commander accessed communications from the forward assault groups and found reports that deepened her confusion. Human resistance was sporadic and seemingly random, but it was also unlike anything Kytherian forces had encountered before. Instead of conventional military tactics, the humans were employing improvised solutions that shouldn't have been possible with their technological limitations. A Kytherian assault on the Mars colonies had been delayed when human engineers somehow converted atmospheric processing equipment into defensive weapons. The modified terraforming systems were creating localized environmental hazards that disrupted Kytherian sensor arrays and forced tactical adjustments. It was annoying rather than dangerous, but it represented the kind of creative problem-solving that efficient military planning wasn't designed to handle. More troubling was the report from the Jupiter system, where human researchers had apparently weaponized their own space habitats. Instead of surrendering or fleeing, they had modified orbital research stations into kinetic bombardment platforms. The stations weren't particularly effective as weapons, but they were being operated in ways that violated basic principles of structural engineering. The humans were literally destroying their own infrastructure to create temporary tactical advantages. But it was the report from Earth's moon that made Zex'thara's markings shift to colors indicating genuine concern. Luna Research Station had been targeted for immediate capture because intelligence suggested it contained significant scientific resources. Instead of the expected archives and laboratory equipment, Kytherian boarding parties had found something unprecedented. The humans had converted their primary research facility into something that defied classification. Dr. Sarah Chen, the scientist whose terraforming project had been dismissed as typical human fantasy, had somehow transformed theoretical ecosystem engineering into practical defensive applications. The station's atmospheric processors had been modified to create controlled environmental pockets throughout the facility. Boarding parties found themselves moving through sections with different gravity, atmosphere, and even temporal flow rates. The modifications shouldn't have been possible with human technology, but the results were undeniable. Kytherian soldiers trained for combat in predictable environments were finding themselves disoriented and tactically disadvantaged by constantly changing conditions. Some sections of the station had been transformed into miniature ecosystems that interfered with Kytherian sensory systems. Others featured gravitational anomalies that disrupted standard movement patterns. Most disturbing of all, the humans weren't just defending themselves. They were learning. Velnara's reports indicated that human responses were becoming more sophisticated with each engagement. Early resistance efforts had been crude improvisations that achieved temporary delays at best. But within hours, the humans were implementing countermeasures that suggested they were analyzing Kytherian technology and developing specific solutions in real time. A mining station in the asteroid belt had somehow reverse-engineered Kytherian shield frequencies and was broadcasting interference patterns that reduced weapon effectiveness. A research outpost near Saturn had modified its communication arrays to jam Kytherian coordination signals. Most impossible of all, several human vessels had begun exhibiting propulsion characteristics that exceeded their known technological capabilities. Zex'thara called for detailed analysis of the human modifications, and found herself staring at data that challenged everything she understood about technological development. The humans were combining unrelated systems in ways that violated established engineering principles but somehow produced functional results. They were using terraforming equipment as weapons, research instruments as defensive systems, and civilian infrastructure as military assets. The pattern suggested a fundamental difference in how humans approached problem-solving. Kytherian technology was based on refined optimization, with each system designed for maximum efficiency in its intended role. Human modifications showed no regard for efficiency or optimization. Instead, they demonstrated an almost reckless willingness to experiment with untested combinations and accept suboptimal performance in exchange for unexpected capabilities. But the most troubling development was what the humans were doing with captured Kytherian technology. Instead of attempting to reverse engineer weapons or defensive systems, they were studying the principles underlying Kytherian engineering and applying those principles to their own impossible projects. Several research facilities had begun broadcasting requests for volunteers to participate in accelerated ecosystem implementation protocols that appeared to involve some kind of biological experimentation. Zex'thara accessed the intercepted communications and found herself looking at proposals that seemed to have emerged from the depths of human imagination rather than practical scientific research. Dr. Chen was coordinating with research teams across human space to implement something called adaptive evolution protocols that would allow human beings to survive in environments that had been considered completely hostile to organic life. The proposals involved genetic modifications that would let humans breathe different atmospheric compositions, tolerate extreme temperature variations, and even survive in the vacuum of space for limited periods. The timeline for implementation was impossibly compressed, requiring techniques that didn't exist and resources that weren't available. But somehow, the humans were making it work. Reports from across the combat zone indicated that human resistance was becoming increasingly effective despite their technological disadvantages. But it wasn't improved weapons or better tactics that were changing the balance of the conflict. It was the humans themselves. Kytherian assault forces attacking a research station near Neptune encountered human defenders who seemed to be operating in environmental conditions that should have been instantly lethal. Soldiers reported engagements with humans who appeared to have been modified to function in near-vacuum conditions, allowing them to fight in areas of their stations that had been breached and depressurized. Another report described humans who had somehow adapted to function in the high-radiation environment around Jupiter's magnetosphere. They were using the radiation itself as a form of camouflage, operating in areas where Kytherian sensors couldn't track them effectively. Most disturbing of all were reports of humans who seemed to have developed new sensory capabilities. Kytherian forces relied heavily on their ability to coordinate through harmonic frequencies that other species couldn't detect or interpret. But human defenders were beginning to respond to Kytherian tactical communications as if they could understand the harmonic patterns. Zex'thara studied the biological analysis reports and found data that challenged her understanding of what was possible in organic evolution. The humans weren't just adapting to hostile environments, they were adapting to become more effective against Kytherian technology specifically. Some appeared to have developed resistance to Kytherian energy weapons. Others showed enhanced reflexes that allowed them to anticipate and avoid Kytherian tactical movements. The changes were happening too quickly to be explained by natural evolution or even advanced genetic engineering. Something else was at work, something that combined human imagination with principles derived from Kytherian technology in ways that produced results neither species should have been able to achieve independently. Velnara requested permission to implement more aggressive assault protocols, arguing that increased pressure would prevent the humans from completing whatever impossible project they were attempting. But Zex'thara found herself hesitating. The human resistance wasn't following any pattern she recognized, and escalating the conflict without understanding what was happening could lead to unforeseen consequences. Instead, she ordered detailed surveillance of human research facilities to determine exactly what they were attempting. The results of that surveillance would fundamentally change everything she thought she knew about warfare, intelligence, and the nature of dreams themselves. The monitoring data revealed that the humans weren't just defending themselves or adapting to survive Kytherian attacks. They were implementing the terraforming project that Dr. Chen had proposed, but they were doing it to themselves instead of to dead worlds. The Genesis Garden protocols were being used to transform human beings into something that could survive and thrive in environments that no organic life had ever encountered. But that was only the beginning. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive energy signatures emanating from the outer system, where human research vessels had been conducting experiments that their own scientists had considered purely theoretical. The signatures matched the output of stellar engineering projects that required technology centuries beyond current human capabilities. Zex'thara accessed the detailed sensor data and found herself staring at readings that violated several fundamental laws of physics. The humans had somehow created stable wormhole apertures using equipment that had been designed for planetary atmospheric research. They were manipulating space-time itself with instruments that should have been capable of nothing more sophisticated than weather control. The implications were staggering. If the humans could create stable wormholes, they could establish supply lines and reinforcement routes that would be impossible for Kytherian forces to predict or intercept. They could evacuate populations to locations beyond Kytherian reach, or bring in resources and personnel from throughout their territory without regard for conventional travel time. But as Zex'thara studied the wormhole signatures more carefully, She realized that the humans weren't using them for military logistics. They were implementing their terraforming project on a scale that transcended anything she had imagined possible. The wormholes were connected to dead worlds throughout the galaxy, worlds that matched the selection criteria Dr. Chen had described in her presentation. Automated systems were already beginning the first phase of atmospheric transformation, but they were doing it using principles that combined human terraforming technology with insights derived from Kytherian engineering. The humans were turning their invasion into an opportunity to accelerate their impossible dream of transforming the galaxy into a garden of life. They were using the crisis to justify resource allocations and experimental procedures that would never have been approved under normal circumstances. They were turning their greatest weakness into a tool for achieving their most ambitious aspirations. And they were succeeding. Monitoring stations throughout Kytherian space began detecting environmental changes on worlds that had been considered permanently lifeless. Atmospheric compositions were shifting toward profiles that could support organic life. Surface temperatures were moderating into ranges that would allow liquid water to exist. Geological activity was increasing in patterns that suggested massive terraforming operations. But the most troubling discovery was that the humans weren't limiting their transformations to worlds in their own territory. They were implementing Genesis Garden protocols on worlds throughout Kytherian space, worlds that the Empire had designated for resource extraction and industrial development. Zex'thara found herself facing a form of warfare that she had never imagined possible. The humans weren't trying to defeat Kytherian forces through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They were transforming the very nature of the galaxy itself, creating conditions that would make their dreams inevitable regardless of the outcome of any military conflict. The commander realized that she was no longer leading an invasion. She was participating in the largest collaborative project in galactic history, whether she wanted to or not. The humans had found a way to turn conquest into cooperation, to transform their enemies into unwilling partners in the creation of something unprecedented. And for the first time in her centuries of military service, Zex'thara began to understand what humans meant when they talked about dreams becoming reality. The transformation reached critical mass 3 weeks after the invasion began, when Zex'thara received a communication that defied every protocol of interstellar warfare. It came not from human military command, but from Dr. Sarah Chen herself, transmitted directly to the Kytherian flagship through methods that shouldn't have existed with current human technology. The message was simple and terrifying in its implications. Commander Zex'thara, we would like to invite you to see what we've accomplished together. Standing on her bridge, surrounded by tactical displays showing the systematic collapse of everything she understood about conquest and resistance, Zex'thara stared at the coordinates Chen had provided. They pointed to a location in the outer system where massive energy readings suggested something unprecedented was taking place. Every military instinct she possessed screamed that this was obviously a trap, but her growing understanding of human psychology suggested something far more complex. The humans weren't trying to defeat her fleet through conventional means. They were trying to show her something that would make victory irrelevant. Velnara's harmonic frequencies carried undertones of panic as she reported the latest intelligence from across the combat zone. What had begun as a straightforward invasion had transformed into something that Kytherian military doctrine had no framework for understanding. Human resistance wasn't weakening under sustained assault. Instead, it was evolving into forms that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Kytherian civilization. The most disturbing reports came from worlds that had been successfully occupied by Kytherian forces. Instead of the expected subjugation and resource extraction, these planets were experiencing rapid environmental changes that made traditional exploitation impossible. Atmospheric processors that humans had left behind were continuing to operate, but they were using principles derived from Kytherian technology to accelerate transformation beyond anything either species had previously achieved. Occupied worlds were developing weather patterns that interfered with Kytherian mining operations. Geological activity was increasing in ways that made industrial infrastructure unstable. Most troubling of all, new forms of life were appearing, organisms that seemed designed to thrive in the presence of Kytherian technology while making it difficult for Kytherian personnel to function effectively. But the situation in human space was even more incomprehensible. Reports from forward reconnaissance units described colonies that had been completely transformed by the integration of human dreams with Kytherian engineering principles. Cities were growing like living organisms, their architecture incorporating biological elements that served both aesthetic and defensive functions. Agricultural areas were producing food supplies that exceeded theoretical maximum yields while simultaneously generating energy and manufacturing complex materials. Most impossible of all, human beings themselves were continuing to evolve at rates that violated everything Kytherians understood about biological development. Populations were adapting to survive in environments that ranged from the crushing depths of gas giant atmospheres to the radiation-soaked regions around stellar phenomena. They were developing sensory capabilities that allowed them to perceive and interact with forms of energy that Kytherian science had considered purely theoretical. The humans weren't just surviving the invasion, they were using it as a catalyst for achieving impossible dreams that should have remained fantasy for millennia. Zex'thara made the decision that would define the rest of her existence. She ordered her personal transport prepared for a journey to the coordinates Dr. Chen had provided, despite Velnara's increasingly frantic warnings about obvious tactical vulnerabilities. The commander had spent centuries studying conquered species, and she understood that she was witnessing something that transcended conventional military outcomes. The humans had found a way to transform warfare itself into a collaborative creative process. The journey to the outer system coordinates took her through regions of space that had been fundamentally altered by human activities. Her transport sensors detected gravitational anomalies that suggested massive engineering projects operating on scales that dwarfed anything the Kytherian Empire had ever attempted. Energy signatures indicated the presence of technologies that combined human innovation with principles derived from Kytherian science in ways that produced capabilities neither species could have achieved independently. But it was the biological readings that truly amazed her. The vacuum of space itself was showing signs of life, organisms that had been designed to survive and thrive in environments that had been considered absolutely hostile to any form of biological activity. These creatures weren't just surviving in space. They were actively participating in construction projects that spanned entire star systems. As her transport approached the coordinates, Zex'thara found herself looking at something that challenged her understanding of what was possible in the physical universe. The humans had constructed a habitat that existed partially in normal space and partially in what appeared to be artificially created dimensional pockets. The structure was simultaneously a space station, a living ecosystem, and a manufacturing facility that was producing technologies beyond the capabilities of either human or Kytherian science. Dr. Sarah Chen was waiting for her in an observation deck that offered views of both normal space and the dimensional anomalies that surrounded the habitat. The human scientist had undergone modifications that allowed her to function in environmental conditions that would have been instantly lethal to baseline humanity, but she retained the essential characteristics that made her recognizably human. The conversation that followed would change everything Zex'thara believed about intelligence, creativity, and the nature of dreams themselves. Chen began by showing her what Genesis Garden had become under the pressure of interstellar conflict. The original terraforming project had evolved into something that transcended planetary transformation. Using insights derived from Kytherian technology, human scientists had developed techniques for transforming space itself into environments capable of supporting life. They were creating ecosystems in the vacuum between stars, establishing biological networks that connected distant worlds through living conduits that served as both transportation and communication systems. But that was only the beginning of what they had accomplished. The humans had discovered that Kytherian technology operated on principles that were fundamentally biological rather than purely mechanical. The crystalline matrices that powered Kytherian ships and weapons were actually fossilized remains of ancient organisms that had evolved to manipulate energy and matter at the quantum level. By studying these principles and combining them with human genetic engineering capabilities, they had created new forms of life that could interact directly with the fundamental forces of the universe. Chen showed her organisms that could survive in the hearts of stars, feeding on nuclear reactions while maintaining complex biological processes. She demonstrated creatures that could manipulate gravitational fields through biological mechanisms, creating localized space-time distortions that allowed faster-than-light travel without requiring traditional propulsion systems. Most remarkably, she revealed humans who had undergone modifications that allowed them to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, perceiving and interacting with aspects of reality that neither species had previously imagined. The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just adapted to survive Kytherian invasion. They had used the challenge as an opportunity to transcend the limitations that had defined biological existence throughout the galaxy. They were becoming something entirely new, a form of life that could reshape reality itself according to principles derived from dreams and imagination rather than purely physical laws. But as Chen continued the demonstration, Zex'thara began to understand the true scope of what the humans had accomplished. They weren't just transforming themselves and their immediate environment. They were implementing Genesis Garden throughout the galaxy, using the Kytherian invasion as a distribution mechanism for technologies and organisms that would eventually transform every world in known space. The modified atmospheric processors that had been left on occupied Kytherian worlds weren't just creating habitable environments. They were establishing biological networks that connected those worlds to the larger Genesis Garden project. Within decades, every planet in Kytherian space would be part of a living ecosystem that spanned the galaxy, an interconnected garden of life that would make traditional concepts of territorial control obsolete. Chen explained the process with the same enthusiasm she had shown during her original presentation to the Global Science Council, but now she was describing accomplished facts rather than theoretical possibilities. Human-designed organisms were already spreading throughout Kytherian space, establishing themselves in environments that range from the molten surfaces of worlds near stellar cores to the frozen reaches of interstellar space. These creatures were designed to enhance rather than replace existing ecosystems, creating more complex and resilient biological networks that could support unprecedented diversity of life. But the most profound transformation was happening to intelligence itself. The integration of human creativity with Kytherian energy manipulation capabilities had produced new forms of consciousness that transcended the limitations of either species. These hybrid intelligences could perceive and interact with reality in ways that allowed them to solve problems and create solutions that neither humans nor Kytherians could have imagined independently. Chen showed Zex'thara recordings of collaborative projects involving these hybrid consciousnesses. They were designing new forms of life that could survive in environments that had been considered completely hostile to biological existence. They were developing technologies that operated on principles that transcended the traditional boundaries between organic and mechanical systems. They were creating art and music and literature that explored concepts that neither species had been capable of expressing before their collision in interstellar space. Most importantly, they were dreaming new dreams that incorporated the best aspects of both human imagination and Kytherian precision, creating visions of possible futures that neither species could have conceived alone. As the demonstration continued, Zex'thara began to understand why her invasion had failed so completely. The humans hadn't defeated Kytherian forces through superior military capabilities. They had absorbed the invasion into a larger creative process that transformed conflict into collaboration, turning enemies into unwilling partners in the creation of something unprecedented. The Kytherian Empire had spent millennia perfecting the art of conquest, developing technologies and strategies that could overwhelm any conceivable resistance. But they had never encountered a species that could transform conquest itself into an opportunity for mutual transcendence. The humans had found a way to turn their greatest weakness into a tool for achieving their most impossible dreams. Chen offered Zex'thara a choice that no conquered enemy had ever been given before. She could continue attempting to impose Kytherian control over human space, fighting against forces that grew stronger and more creative with each engagement. Or she could participate in the Genesis Garden project as a willing collaborator, contributing Kytherian knowledge and capabilities to a vision that would ultimately benefit both species and every other form of life in the galaxy. The decision wasn't difficult. Zex'thara had spent her career studying conquered species, and she understood that she was witnessing the emergence of something that transcended traditional concepts of victory and defeat. The humans had found a way to make their dreams contagious, spreading their vision of what the galaxy could become, until even their enemies began to share those impossible aspirations. She sent a message to the Kytherian fleet ordering immediate cessation of hostilities and requesting that all vessels report to designated coordinates for integration into Genesis Garden operations. The response was predictable: accusations of treason, demands for explanation, and threats of court-martial and execution. But Zex'thara had seen what humans could accomplish when they refused to abandon their dreams, even in the face of impossible odds. The transformation of the Kytherian Empire took less time than anyone had expected. When presented with clear evidence of what Genesis Garden could accomplish, most Kytherian commanders found themselves unable to resist the opportunity to participate in something that transcended their previous understanding of what was possible. They had been trained to seek efficiency and optimization, and the human project represented the ultimate expression of both principles applied to the challenge of creating life and beauty throughout the galaxy. Within months, Kytherian vessels were participating in terraforming operations that spanned dozens of star systems. Kytherian engineers were working alongside human scientists to develop technologies that neither species could have created independently. Kytherian artists were collaborating with human dreamers to design ecosystems that combined practical functionality with aesthetic beauty on scales that had never been attempted before. But the most profound change was in the nature of dreams themselves. The integration of human imagination with Kytherian capabilities had created new forms of consciousness that could envision and implement possibilities that transcended the limitations of either species. These hybrid intelligences were dreaming dreams that incorporated elements neither humans nor Kytherians had been capable of conceiving alone, creating visions of possible futures that served as blueprints for ongoing transformation of galactic civilization. Years later, when historians attempted to analyze what had happened during the failed Kytherian invasion of human space, they would struggle to classify it according to traditional categories of warfare and conquest. It had been simultaneously a military conflict, a scientific collaboration, an artistic project, and a fundamental transformation of what it meant to be intelligent life in the universe. The humans had accomplished something that no previous species had managed. They had found a way to make their dreams more powerful than their enemies' weapons. They had transformed the galaxy itself into a canvas for the greatest collaborative artwork ever attempted, proving that imagination and creativity were not weaknesses to be exploited, but forces that could reshape reality itself. Dr. Sarah Chen's Genesis Garden project had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, but not in the way she had originally imagined. Instead of transforming dead worlds into gardens, she had transformed the very nature of life and consciousness throughout the galaxy. The dreams that had once seemed like impossible fantasies had become the foundation for a new form of civilization that transcended the boundaries between species, between organic and mechanical systems, and between what was real and what was merely imagined. The galaxy had become a garden, but it was a garden of dreams made manifest, where consciousness itself could grow and evolve in ways that had never been possible before. And at the center of it all was the simple recognition that some dreams are too powerful to be defeated by any force in the universe, because they have the capacity to transform their enemies into collaborators in their own realization. Zex'thara spent the rest of her existence working alongside human dreamers and Kytherian engineers to expand Genesis Garden beyond their home galaxy, carrying the vision of life and beauty to distant corners of the universe, where new forms of consciousness could emerge and new dreams could take root. She had learned that the greatest victories were not won through conquest, but through the courage to imagine impossible futures, and the determination to make those dreams real regardless of the obstacles that stood in the way. The humans had not just survived their encounter with a superior military force, they had transformed their conquerors into gardeners, proving that dreams were indeed the most powerful force in the universe when wielded by beings who refused to accept limitations on what was possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.